and thank you so much for coming today, and I really want to thank Vicki for having me be part of this wonderful think tank. You can see that my title is A Dyad During Pregnancy, the Mother-Infant Relationship Before Birth and Why It Matters. We're going to be coming to this theme over and over again, that there's a relationship before birth between this mother and baby. And I, too, am going to start with a disclosure slide, which basically says I have no conflicts of interest, so we can whip through that. I will say, however, that I am from New York City, and if I start to do that very bad New York thing of talking super quickly, please wave your hands and let me know that I am acting like a New Yorker, not being very polite. I want to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, and again, really looking at that pregnancy relationship. I'm going to touch on the idea, which you all really know, but to emphasize it, that the fetus is hidden, but you probably don't really think about this part. It is actually quite a receptive fetus, and we've already heard a bit about that in terms of brain development. There is maternal transmission of her experiences to the fetus, and I'm going to be covering that, and then really wanting to make the point of the implications of this relationship before birth, and that is that this is a prime opportunity for early intervention and prevention. All right, this hidden yet receptive fetus. We all know that the fetus is rather hard to get access to. However, the fetus experiences the mother's life. The fetus's development, and again, all that brain development you just heard about from Pat, that's going on in utero. That means the fetus is perceiving and actually beginning to make associations in utero, learning. Therefore, it's really being affected by the mother's experience. And I want to point out, this is a 3D ultrasound of a 29-week-old fetus. This is Rodin's thinker. I hope you can see this. However, Rodin was not so clever to have a tongue sticking out in the middle. I hope you can also appreciate that. What I want to do is play for you here, so this is where we're going to get some sound. This is also our participant, the other part of this relationship. This is the fabulous sound of the fetal heart rate. Sounds like wild horseshoe horses clopping along, galloping along. And if you can make out on the left-hand side, this is a profile of the baby's head. The transducer is right in the middle there at the heart, so you're seeing, that's where we're picking up the sound. You're getting a cross-section of the arm on the upper left, and now you're going to be able, you see that heart beating, you can see that going on, and you're getting an image. It's going to come in a bit better. You capture that. That's the skull and the brain inside there, and you're getting the profile. One of the most joyous moments for all expectant parents is to have this moment of getting access to that fetus and being reminded this relationship is starting. You're getting a little bit more of the heart beating. All right. I'm going to give you some examples to really try to drive home the point that the fetus is there and is registering the maternal experience. Newborns, right at birth, newborns suck more to the scent, which tells us they prefer their mother's breast milk to that of other scents. And this is based on the continuity between the olfactory, the smell cues, in the amniotic fluid to which the fetus was exposed for many months and those in breast milk. Already an association for the baby being made between who is my mother. Newborns suck more. They prefer a tape recording of their mother's reading Dr. Seuss versus a stranger woman's voice reading Dr. Seuss. And this is presumably because for 9 months they have been exposed to her voice, and it's become very familiar. The building blocks of this relationship. We also know that fetuses register their mother's experience, and this is really a biological connection. So women who exercise during pregnancy were able to look at the fetus before birth and see that that exercise in their mother is associated with better heart rate regulation, autonomic nervous system regulation, even before birth. And finally, and this is what I'm really going to be touching on today, is that maternal emotional experiences, they too seem to affect the fetus before birth with implications for the future child's development. So to start this, I want to tell you about a study back in 1967. This is a study, we call it an N of 1. And this is how they tested, is maternal experience really affecting the fetus? So they had a pregnant woman come into the lab, and they said to her, "You're breathing a gas which contains only half the amount of oxygen necessary to support fetal life. But your normal body mechanisms will probably make up and compensate for this altered environment for your fetus." Oh my goodness. That is quite an acute stress experience for women. It's a fright to be told this. At any time in pregnancy, this happened to be late in pregnancy. So what happened? What you see here on the top is the maternal heart rate, and then on the bottom panel, you're seeing the fetal heart rate. And you see this term, psychic stimulation. That's the induction of the stressor. And remarkably, well, not so remarkably, the mother's heart rate went up to this frightful experience. That's what our bodies do. That's our fight-flight response. But in turn, the fetal heart rate went up, coincident with the mother having an emotional experience. So the fetus registers the mother's emotional experiences. We're seeing clear evidence of it here. And then one thing I'm going to be talking about is what is the mechanism for this transmission? One possible idea is the stress hormone cortisol, which I'll talk about. And then I'll also touch on what Pat already described is the process of epigenetics, changing the functioning of genes based on what are called methylation marks added to a gene to turn it on or off in its function. So all of this research falls under a category which is known as Dyad. That stands for Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. So not just acutely, but over time, women's experiences affect the fetus and shape their future development. And this was beautifully summarized in a Time magazine article several years ago. And really, this is the phrase to remember, how the first 9 months shape the rest of your life. So what about stress? What about stress that is not just momentary and in the lab, but is, again, what Pat referred to as toxic stress? That is chronic stress, anxiety or depression that the woman is feeling over pregnancy. We're beginning to see how that affects the child's brain behavior, their neurobehavioral development. And here I'm going to give you an example of these kind of data that support this Dyad model in terms of stress, chronic stress, toxic stress, affecting the child's development before birth. This is a paper from O'Connor and Vivek Glover based on a sample of about 4,000 children in the UK, followed from when the women were pregnant, and in this data set, the children are 6 to 7 years old. What I'm going to show you is a strong association. These are the numbers in bold on the left are called odds ratios. So the more antenatal anxiety, the more prenatal anxiety this woman had, that toxic stress, the more likely her male and female children at age 6 and 7 were to go on to have inattention hyperactivity disorder, often gets called ADHD, to have conduct problems and other emotional problems. So a strong association between a kind of toxic stress and what gets grouped together under the term of psychopathology, a risk factor for children's development. So in my lab, and well as others across the world, we've been pursuing this Dyad model, and here I'm giving you a title from a recently published paper, and I'll briefly tell you what we found. We took sleeping newborn infants and we had them go under magnetic resonance imaging, and we looked at the functional connectivity in parts of their brain while they were asleep, so it's a resting state. And what we saw is a greater connectivity between the amygdala, about which you already heard. The amygdala is part of the limbic system, our emotion brain, it gets called, and the frontal cortex, which is oriented to our higher cognitive processes. There was greater connectivity in these babies' brains who were exposed to untreated maternal depression, a kind of toxic stress. And what this told us is that these babies' brains at birth were already wired, bless you, already precipitated. They were ready to greet a world of danger. Their amygdala was fired up and connected to the frontal part of their brain in anticipation of what if it's a dangerous world out there? Am I ready? And this was from the exposure of untreated maternal depression during pregnancy. But interestingly, we then wanted to know, can we see this in the fetuses? Are these fetuses who have at birth difference in this connectivity in their brain, is their behavior any different before we can't access them very easily? And we did indeed find an association. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a complicated graph to explain this to you. But first, here is a very pregnant woman, and this is the ways that we ask her and her fetus questions. We're doing what's called all sorts of instrumentation to get biological signals from her and from the fetus. And most importantly for this talk, we're getting fetal movement and fetal heart rate. So I'm going to show you, this is the graph of fetal data, and I'll walk you through this. So in my lab, when we stress women, we don't give them a life-threatening stress. We have them instead do a cognitive challenge, which is called a Stroop task. But we also do something very important, is we learn about who they are in terms of the levels of toxic stress in their lives. And to do this, in part, we do a psychiatric interview. So you can see there are different color blocks there designating that some of these fetuses, because this is fetal data, have mothers in the red who have anxiety and depression that's untreated, or in the purple, they have untreated depression. The fetuses in the green, that lime green, their mothers were screened, and they just do not have toxic stress in their lives. They have usual stress. So what we're seeing here, and then if you focus on the two circles, is that when the women did this cognitive Stroop task in our lab, and they told us, oh, you're stressing me out, this is making me nervous, I'm not getting the right answers. The fetuses of women with that toxic stress, depression, anxiety, they had a heart rate increase. And the fetuses of women who did not have any of this toxic stress show no response. And what's amazing is similar to the data I showed you before with the life-threatening stress in the lab, the fetal heart rate goes up when the women are perturbed in the lab, those with toxic stress, and then they go back down. So that, again, you're seeing the fetus registering maternal experience. But here, the reactive fetuses are only the ones who've been exposed to toxic stress all through the course of pregnancy by their mother's untreated depression and anxiety. Now let's go back to the brain findings, that connectivity in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Interestingly, and to us really remarkably and just so important, the babies who had that greater connectivity, so their amygdala was ready for danger signals in the world, they also were the fetuses who had this heart rate increase during mother's perturbation, the stress in the lab. So even as fetuses in the heart rate, we can see an indication that they too are ready to be very aware of signals coming their way. They're anticipating danger potentially. They're more vigilant. They're just on the lookout for what may come their way. We next asked, well, is this fetal behavior, can we see it in behavior once they're out and these babies are more accessible at 4 months old? So here we looked at what often gets categorized as temperament, their motor and cry reactivity to novelty. Again, how is this brain behavior in this baby responding to stimuli that comes its way? And this is a paper that I did with a close colleague of mine. You're going to hear a bit about her, Liz Werner. And we were able to show, again, going back to the fetal data, that the fetuses who were more reactive to mother's perturbation, that stress experience, they go on to be more reactive 4-month-olds. So this is the test portion of your morning. I'm going to show you 2 videotapes, and I'd like you to tell me which is the more reactive 4-month-old baby. So here's the first one. It's just cute, right? Watch this all day. Okay, next tape, please. Oh, I have to do that. There you go. This one just happens to be louder. I'm not sure it's our recording. I apologize. Start to get a little fuss. Okay, who's the more reactive baby? Well, I think you're all saying number 2. Good. All right. Yes. So these are exemplar babies of what we've done, on group averages statistically. And again, we're seeing that more reactive fetuses in their heart rate responses to perturbation go on to be more reactive infants. So this really brings up the question, how is there maternal transmission of emotion experience, toxic stress, depression, anxiety? How does it get to the fetus to get under the fetus's skin and shape their behavior and brain development? So the model for this is, again, this maternal toxic stress, this subjective mental experience, must have a mediating biological signal by which it then alters in utero environment. That has an effect on fetal behavior and then potentially puts that child at risk for psychopathology. So we again are focusing on toxic stress as the exposure affecting the baby's outcome. Associated with toxic stress is often a differential regulation, a dysregulation of stress hormone cortisol. That gets grouped as a kind of hormone, a glucocorticoid hormone. I'm saying all this to show you a title of a recent paper we published. And I'm not going to go into too many details, but to say that what we found is it was an alteration in the placenta that was the pathway by which maternal experience was getting to the fetus and shaping development. So what we found, in fact, is that there's a gene in the placenta, everyone has known about this gene, called HSD11 beta. It generates an enzyme that differentiates. It determines how much cortisol is going to get through and affect the fetus. So that when this gene is functioning well, it deactivates cortisol as it crosses the placenta. What we found is that the greater the toxic stress, the more through epigenetic processes that gene was turned off. And when that gene was turned off, we know from animal studies there's more cortisol getting into the in utero environment. What we found in our studies is that the fetal behavior was altered. There was a decrement in the central nervous system development of these fetuses, all stemming from toxic stress in the woman and being mediated through gene functioning change in the placenta. So finally, this dyadic relationship during pregnancy, it really is therefore a prime opportunity for early intervention and prevention for both the woman and her future child. So I've given you data, and I hope to really get you convinced about this idea that development begins before birth. We have a relationship between the mother and fetus before birth. I've shown you that the fetus registers and is shaped by maternal experiences through a biological transmission. We talked about the baby in utero learning the maternal scent, learning her voice, cardiovascular regulation in the fetus being associated with the mother exercising. And then I really showed you a good bit, and there's a lot more out there about how toxic stress during pregnancy impacts the child, the 6-year-old child's development. And then I showed you our work on brain at birth, on fetal behavior, and also a pathway by which they may happen in changes in the placenta and how it's functioning. It's gene regulation in the placenta. I also, of course, want to emphasize, and we're going to hear so much about this today, and I'm very excited to hear more about it, is the baby is in the mother's mind before birth, and of course in her heart. So there's also a psychological relationship developing long before the baby is born. And we know that how the mother holds the baby in her mind psychologically before birth has a lot to do with the future relationship between the two of them. And this has been very robustly shown in terms of her ways of viewing attachment, her sense of confidence in people loving each other, influences how she goes on to parent her child and then the relationship between the parent and child. With this in mind, again, my close colleague Liz Werner and I have developed an intervention that starts in pregnancy. It's a dyadic approach to reduce maternal prenatal stress. You can imagine why we want to do that, given the data I've shown you. Support the mother-infant relationship even before birth, and thereby prevent postpartum depression, particularly in women at risk for it. So this is an intervention based on the conceptualization of postpartum depression as a potential disorder of the dyad. There's that term dyad again. And one that can be approached through preventative psychological and behavioral changes in the mother that affect her and the child even before birth. We call this PrEP, and I will define that for you in a minute. I want to focus just on the statistics of postpartum depression. Prenatal toxic stress is a huge risk factor for postpartum depression, and postpartum depression is about between 10 and 15, sometimes 20% on average in the population. For those in poverty, in very adverse circumstances, the rate goes up to 40% have postpartum depression. And I believe you all are familiar with how deleterious that is for the mother and the mother-child relationship. So PrEP, practical resources for effective postpartum parenting. Actually, before I go there, I'm going to take that away from you. Let me tell you, because you saw that circle, and I really want to emphasize that piece of PrEP, and you're going to hear so much more about this relationship and the mother and the baby influencing each other and part of healthy brain development happening in the context of a social relationship. So PrEP is building on that bidirectional influences between mother and baby, and we're starting before birth. This is a 4-session intervention, very brief. 2 of the sessions happen in pregnancy, and they're linked to OB care. So the woman with a coach has PrEP sessions at the same time, well, right after she has her standard OB care that happens, as you know, very frequently towards the end of pregnancy. So the bidirectional influence between mother and baby that starts before birth for all the reasons I've just described to you, biologically and psychologically, both levels, we're leveraging that with PrEP to do preventative work for postpartum well-being, but also wanting to reduce stress during pregnancy. So if you focus on the upper right, a big component of PrEP is helping the woman to have a wide range of tools for caring for her baby, feeling confident she knows how to care for her baby, and potentially optimizing the baby's regulation. As the baby is better regulated, the mother is better regulated, as she sleeps better, baby sleeps better, better sleep, less depression, more confidence, more ease in caring for baby. Baby experiences better ease. This is such a complex, beautiful, bidirectional influence between mother and baby that from our vantage point of PrEP starts prenatally, as I think I've really tried to describe to you why we think it starts prenatally, and that's where we want to harness prenatally, getting the mother and baby off to the right track. A big part of what goes on in the prenatal piece of stress is trying to prenatal piece of PrEP, is trying to reduce her stress to have the best regulated fetus and future baby and give her confidence going into the postpartum period. This is very briefly, I'm going to go through this, the parts of PrEP and how the brochure is and the skills we try to give babies. I think I'm getting to be asked off stage. I have 2 more minutes. We'll see if I'm allowed. And 2 really quick slides. In a sample highly at risk for postpartum depression, we've shown that PrEP actually cuts the rate in half of postpartum depression. And we also showed that women who went through PrEP compared to what's called enhanced treatment as usual actually judge their babies as crying and fussing less. There's part of that cycle between mother and baby. We think mothers are doing better because they're actually also rating their babies as doing better, and they function as a unit. All right, to wrap up, beyond shared genes interacting with the postnatal environment, there is a possible 3rd pathway by which toxic stress affects children's development via maternal mental health during pregnancy. Depression, stress, and anxiety, these are typically modifiable factors. We know how to help when there is access to decent behavioral health care. We can help pregnant and postpartum women, and by doing so, help the next generation. So really, we are having this whole child approach and wanting to start that in the prenatal period for the mother and the child. Thank you very much.